Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Staple Inn for what I am informed is our first in-person event since the start of the pandemic. So we're very pleased to welcome you here today. I'm just going to run you through a few housekeeping bits before we get underway. The first is just to ask that if you've got your mobile phone, please could you switch it off or to on silent for the duration of the ceremony. Also to let you know, we are not planning a fire alarm to go off, so if it does go off, please do evacuate through the nearest fire exit, and IFOA staff will be on hand to direct you should that be necessary. And also just to let you know that following the award ceremony, there will be a drinks reception which will be taking place in the room where your teas and coffees were a little bit earlier, so please do stay for that if you're able to. So with all that done, I'd just like to welcome you once again to Staple Inn and now hand over to the President of the IFOA, Matt Saker.
Evening, Matthew's already welcomed you, but I'll do it again. A warm welcome to you all. Thanks for coming along this evening. I'm Matt Saker, President of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. So my role here really is just to set things going this evening. This is the first face-to-face meeting we've had in this place in Staple Inn since COVID. I was saying to someone earlier, I've got mixed memories about this place because I took an exam here when I was a student back in the day, which I failed. But I've also had some good memories of this place, and it's great, I think, to be back in our spiritual home this evening. And thank you all for turning up. So you're never quite sure coming out of COVID, whether people will re-engage with the face-to-face. Our members have told us that they want to return to that, so we're sort of running the conferences again this autumn. Some of you have seen, but thank you all for turning up. So it's not just me and the judges this evening. That's a good thing, I think. So as you can see, we're here to celebrate the inaugural Frank Redington Prize awarding this evening. This initiative really is a new way of thinking from the IFOA. Particularly in the thought leadership space, building on our strategy and hopefully facilitating the strategy, and also leveraging the idea of the actuarial profession, the IFOA being a sort of learning society. So I was delighted with the number of entrants we had. We're obviously celebrating the prize winners here today, but we did have a number of entrants, and I've produced these papers in the past. It is hard work. It's a lot of effort goes into them. So I would like to thank everyone who submitted an essay for this particular award. And I'm pleased Sway Che's turned up because I'm handing over to him in a minute. So I don't have to stall quite as much as I would have done. The prizes, the categories that we're talking about this evening, there were two that we're awarding prizes for. The first is, what would a sustainable economic and finance system for the public interest be? And the second is, what would a sustainable and effective UK pension system for the people? So we'll be awarding prizes for both of those categories. And it won't have escaped you, I'm sure, that both of those topics have been in the press recently, since the government's mini-budget a few weeks ago. So it would be remiss of me not to mention that on this occasion. I know the judges have some strong views on this, and I'm sure they'll be commenting later. But there has been a lot of press commentary around the LDI issue in respect of defined benefit pension schemes, which actuaries are obviously very closely involved with. Obviously a very complex topic. I won't seek to go into it now. Lots of different views as to what caused it and what the remediation actions might be. All I would say, the IFOA hasn't issued anything publicly on this matter yet, but we have been talking about it internally quite extensively. And I suppose just to reassure you, the regulatory board, which is the independent board within the IFOA that sort of oversights the profession, if you like, did get onto this very quickly, considered whether we should issue a risk alert. A decision was taken that we didn't think that was appropriate, although we are keeping that under review. But we are trying to be proactive as a profession. We've raised, the chair of our reg board has raised the issue with JFAR, which is the Joint Forum for Actuarial Regulation. It's constituted by, as the name suggests, the key actuarial regulators, so the FRC, pension regulator, PRA, and the IFOA also sits on that. So we are facilitating getting it onto their agenda, and I think that group is the right group to be talking about this issue and deciding how we fix it in the future, if that's the correct way of putting it. So getting back to this evening's proceedings, I want to quickly introduce and thank the judges. They're sat in the front row here. So we have Sir John Kay, leading economist and chair of the judging panel. Welcome, John. We have Honorary Group Captain Sally Bridgeland, IFA, chair and non-executive director at various asset management and insurance companies. And we have Right Honourable David Heath, CBE chair of the IFOA Policy Advisory Group. There is also another judge who sadly can't be here tonight. That's Torsten Bell, who's chief executive of the Resolution Foundation. But I would want to just thank you for your support, really, and the time that I know you've given over the last weeks and months. There were, as I said, quite a few entrants, so trawling through those. I'm sure you enjoyed it, but I'm sure it was a lot of work. So thank you very much for that. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Punter Southall and Milliman. I know there's representatives from both organisations here tonight. So without their support, we wouldn't be here either. So maybe we can just thank them as well. So that's all I really wanted to say. Before John gets up, I'm going to hand over to Sway Che, who's going to come up and talk about Frank Redington Prize specifically, but also more broadly thought leadership within the IFOA. So I'll let you do that now. I'll just say thank you again for turning up and supporting the event this evening. And I look forward to catching up with many of you for a drink afterwards, hopefully. Thank you very much. Sway Che, the floor's yours.
Thanks, Matt. Slightly late because of traffic and a bit distracted by the television just now. And sorry for not getting to the mood, to the mood before the event. But anyway, I'll do my best. Wishing everyone a good afternoon and a welcome. It's great to see so many colleagues from within the profession and also friends from across the industry at this presentation of the Frank Redington's Thought Leadership Essay Prizes. One of my most enjoyable responsibilities and highlights during my presidential term was the establishment of the IFOA's Thought Leadership Program. In my presidential address, I signaled that one of my priorities was to revive the spirit of the learning society and to bring thought leadership to the foreground. There was a feeling amongst many of my senior colleagues within the profession, many of whom are here tonight, and some of you are potentially winners, that the profession must have a stronger voice in influencing regulation and in addressing the sustainability and societal issues of our time. Since January 2021, the Thought Leadership Program has hosted a swath of debates focusing on issues from COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis to how we can reform our financial system for the better. The aim of the program has helped us to bring the thought leadership capabilities of actuaries to the foreground and reposition the IFOA at the center of key societal debates to provide a forum and a voice for actuaries in addressing pressing and public interest social problems, and also the strategic issues confronting the IFOA and the profession. I'm grateful to those who helped to make the program a reality, including our generous sponsors, Milliman and Punter Southall, who has sponsored the prize money for this competition, but also my close colleague and friend from Asia, Dr. Patrick Poon, whose generosity helped support the overall program last year. And I also like to place my appreciation for the IFOA executive, in particular Annette Spencer, Henry Thompson, and Tim for helping to run the competition. It was on the subject of financial regulation through the Finance in the Public Interest series with the thought leaders including Sir Paul Collier, Andrew Haldane, and of course Sir John Kay, which ignited the discussion around the role of actuaries, our culture, and the regulatory frameworks that led to the creation of this essay competition. The timing of this prize ceremony couldn't be more poignant in the context of the events in the UK in the last 4 weeks. Mr. Kwasi Kwarteng's mini-budget created a number of unforeseen and unintended consequences, not only for the British politics, economy, financial services, but also raised questions on the robustness and the resilience of the UK pension schemes and also the role of the actuarial profession. As the yields on gilts rose rapidly, is it expected or unexpected for it to result in such a significant selling of both growth assets and gilts? Is what has been occurring good or bad for the pension system? And why has this occurred? What would be a better way for pensions to be structured? Indeed, at the highest level, all these questions and reflections bring us directly to the two questions of these Redington Essay Prizes. One, what will be a sustainable economic and finance system for the public interest? Two, what will be a sustainable and effective UK pension for the people? I know it is difficult for us to come to a coherent and unifying answer before the dust settles. But let us see this as an opportunity for the profession to bring insightful analysis and clear thinking to what is possible in a very uncertain world. Actuarial science was born in response to make financial sense of the future and to help us to plan a future that is fraught with uncertainty. And in a world of systemic and radical uncertainty, our traditional mathematical toolkit require reinvention, and there needs to be a fundamental rethinking of the philosophy of what is possible. My own personal take is that actuarial science enables us to make choices and trade-offs and rearrange payoffs, but it cannot and it does not eliminate uncertainty. I look forward to hear from our prize winners their points of views to these questions. So why are the prizes named after Frank Redington? Frank Redington is one of the most distinguished and celebrated actuaries in the last 100 years. He has often been the inspiration behind the reinvigoration of thought leadership within the profession. Frank Redington was born in 1906 in Leeds, graduated from Magdalen College, Cambridge University. Frank joined the Prudential in 1928, gained fellowship in 1934. He was appointed Chief Actuary of the Prudential in 1951 and continued in that capacity until his retirement in 1968. The profession was particularly close to Redington's heart and was enriched by his long and distinguished service. He served on the council for many years and became a vice president and then president between 1958 and 1960. Frank Redington is most widely known for his development of immunization theory in 1952, as he introduced that concept in his paper on life office valuations. And these principles are also at the heart of LDI, liability-driven investment. However, I would wonder if Frank Redington would himself approve leverage LDI as a means of boosting overall return. I am sure from his writings and his focus on virtues, Frank Redington would have encouraged us to have an honest reflection on our roles in the current crisis and seek our leading thinkers to propose potential solutions with bold mindsets that are typically required to address systemic risks. Whatever you think of the role of actuaries, we should not be silent on the grounds of public interest. With rising volatility and uncertainty and a shift to concerns on sustainability in all its forms in recent years, we could not have chosen a better time to embark on a renewal of thought leadership in our profession. Through the Thought Leadership Program, I've seen more and more colleagues take more courageous stance on many social issues of our time. It is great to see our profession being slightly bolder and not converging on consensus positions. The Redington Prizes invited entries from strategic thinkers who are not afraid to challenge orthodoxy and to put forward radical challenge in a way that supports our public interest commitment. I would like to thank all those who stepped forward to enter the competition. Frank Redington's vision was a profession that could tread the narrow path of wise counsel to society and growth of a thriving financial sector. This prize must only be the beginning of this journey, as there is still much to do. Before I hand over to Sir John, I will leave you with a quote by Redington which embodies our thought leadership vision. Actuaries should not be content merely to operate as backroom technicians. There is a duty to come forward and to speak out of these questions of national finance, to be prepared to contribute in a forceful yet non-partisan way. I congratulate the many winners who will be announced tonight. For many of you, it marks the end of a very specific and worthwhile intellectual endeavor. But it certainly does not mark the end of IFOA's commitment to thought leadership. To quote another great Englishman, this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. So my fellow actuaries, in these uncertain times, let us continue to stay true to our public interests, be courageous, change the way we think about ourselves, and together bring actuarial thought leadership to the foreground. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Srichi, and let me add my welcome to you all to Staple Inn today. I was last year in this hall, I think 5 years ago, when Sally was president of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. And then I took the opportunity to talk about the history of probability, the surprisingly short history of probability, because people simply did not think in probabilistic terms until the 17th century. They've done it a great deal since, not always to good cause. That lecture, the lecture I gave then, was an element in an intellectual journey which I have been on, an intellectual journey which was developed further in a book which I wrote with Mervyn King called Radical Uncertainty and published in 2020. Just as the pandemic hit, there being few better examples of uncertainty, and whether it was radical uncertainty is a question we might ask. But I think there would be quite an interesting postscript to be added to that lecture today, because there has been a great deal both happening in the world and happening in the way we think about the world that is relevant to that subject. So it's very appropriate that we should be here tonight with the actuarial profession raising these issues and having made a contribution through the institution of these prizes. The Frank Redington Prize is sponsored by Milliman and Ponte were judged by a distinguished panel of which I had the pleasure of being chair. We need to think, as I'm implying, more about these issues, both about pensions and about the contribution of finance, not only to the pension system, but to the wider economy. So building on the Finance in the Public Interest series that I had the chance to participate in back in March 2021, the prize focuses on these two areas, the areas of pensions and the areas of the structure of the financial system more broadly. So that led to entrants to the prize being asked to answer one of the following two questions. What would be the sustainable economic and finance system for the public interest? note for the public interest, not for people in the financial sector, a confusion which is very widespread and has been particularly widespread in the last few weeks and months. And what would be a sustainable and effective UK pension system for the people? The judging panel scrutinised all the entries for originality, practicality, risks and opportunities, and I'm pleased that Sally and David have been able to join me in the hall this afternoon. So we need to thank everyone who took the time and effort to submit an entry, including particularly the shortlisted entrants who are with us today. And once again, thanks to Milliman and Punter Southall and to the IFOA staff who have made this whole competition and this evening possible. Shortly, I'll pass over to Sally Bridgeland, who will host the question and answer session for the pensions question, and I will then do the same for the finance question. And at the end of what has been quite an eventful day for all of us, he will then have the opportunity to relax with a drink, which I think many of us will need and benefit from. So without further introduction, I'm very pleased to hand over to Sally Bridgeland to judge the pensions question. Sally.
Thank you very much, Matt, Sweet Chair, and Sir John, for your excellent introductions. In all the intervening time with COVID, I'd completely forgotten my Worshipful Company of Actuaries Master's lecture, which John gave and had us all completely wrapped in the uncertainty. But never has life been more uncertain. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening and to have served as a member of the judging panel. Our first awards tonight are for the question titled, What would be a sustainable and effective UK pension system for the people, kindly sponsored by Punter Southall. And it's a question very close to my heart. I was a pensions actuary and then investment consultant for 20 years. I rather hesitate to say that I was there at the birth of LDI, but I was. And that was over 20 years ago now. And again, who would have thought that it would have developed in the way that it has? Who would have thought the world would have developed in the way that it has? There are a lot of lessons, and I'm more than happy to talk at length about LDI over a drink afterwards. But now, today, we're asking in this question, we wanted entrants to propose a system or a reform to the current system which would deliver a low-cost, affordable pension to the majority of the population. No easy feat, as you can imagine. We also asked that the proposal be aware of long-term trends, such as increasing longevity, long-term care needs, the technological landscape, as these are the same issues that policymakers will have to contend with as they seek to make our pension system fit for the future. After a long and very enjoyable debate with my fellow judges, we actually found it too difficult to pick one standout entry. So I'm pleased to announce that we will be commending 3 entrants tonight who will each receive a share of the prize fund. And I'd like to invite them all to join me on the stage to participate in a question and answer session. So can I please ask Colm Fagan, Nick Silver, and Craig Turnbull to join me on the stage. So what I'm going to do is ask all of our 3 shortlisted entrants, because I'm conscious that most of the people in the audience won't have read all the entries. So what we're going to do is ask the entrants to give us a 3-minute introduction to themselves, but more importantly, the main themes in their entries. and then I'm going to ask a follow-up question and give a bit of context about what I personally liked about their entries, as well as talking about or asking them about the risks and the practicalities around actually implementing their answers. As Suiche has already said, this is the end of the beginning, and to make sure that that beginning develops into something constructive for the actuarial profession, all of these ideas have got their merits, and it's important that we build on those in the future to develop our ideas with other practitioners. Could I ask Colm to start off then, please, with introducing yourself and the main themes of your entry?
Thank you, Sally. I have actually prepared an introductory comment about the entire entry, but anyway.
That's great. That's great.
Okay, myself, very simple. I'm a retired life consulting, actually. I did once upon a time working pensions, but it was actually over 40 years ago now. So I did come to pensions with a completely new view, but one difference that I have managed my own pension fund for the last 20 years or so, both before and after retirement. And I think the after retirement aspect of it was a key influence for me in the content of my paper. So just to say a little bit about my entry, I said the brief, as Sally said earlier, the brief for the prize is to propose a system or reform to the current system which would deliver a low-cost, affordable pension to the majority of the population. I am proposing a reform to the UK's auto-enrolment system, a reform which delivers more than 50% better value to members. It raises investment returns, lowers expenses, and removes an entire swathe of advisor costs. It also shifts the investment focus from short-term returns to sustainable returns over the long term. Two essential requirements for a better value pension are low costs and high investment returns. The current auto-enrolment system goes some way towards achieving both goals, but it falls short in two key areas. Firstly, the low-cost criterion is satisfied pre-retirement, but not post-retirement. High charges are far too common in drawdown products. Also, most retirees, especially those unfamiliar with the stock market, who comprise the vast majority of auto-enrolment members, need regular investment advice during their retirement. The high cost of advice can cause a significant drag on returns, particularly for the less well-off. Secondly, the high investment returns criterion is satisfied by investing in equities. Default funds invest heavily in equities when members are young, but lifestyling means switching to bonds and cash in the lead-in to retirement. This is precisely when accounts have their highest earnings potential. Cautious investment strategies and consequently lower investment returns normally continue all through retirement, possibly for 30 years or more. At the extreme, annuities imply 100% in bonds. The reduction in investment returns is most marked for the less well-off, who can least afford the volatile luxury of equity investment. I am proposing that the scheme will have just one pooled fund for both active and retired members. It will be invested entirely in equities. Investment returns will be smoothed, and all member transactions with the scheme will be at smooth rather than market values. Smoothing transforms the volatility of investment returns, as these two charts show. Are you there, Matthew? Yeah, lovely, thank you. Thank you. The chart on the left shows smoothed and market values for the 30 years, 1990 to 2019. The one on the right shows frequency distributions of monthly returns for the graph on the left. It's actually the differential of the graph on the left. Market returns fluctuate wildly. Smooth returns are positive every month for the entire 30-year period. Smoothing reduces the volatility of returns to such an extent that members and administrators will be able to treat pension accounts like high-interest deposit accounts. Members add to their accounts while working and make regular drawings from them in retirement. There will be no need for investment advice, which means significant cost savings. I'm also proposing a solution to the longevity risk. Retired members won't have to worry about the risk of outliving their savings. They will be able to enjoy a secure income for life while remaining fully invested in equities and without having to sign away their or their estate's right to unused capital on early death. The fact that smoothed values will sometimes be above market values, sometimes below them, means that strict rules will be needed to prevent financially astute members from exploiting differences between smoothed and market values to their advantage, and of necessity to other members' disadvantage, since the scheme's mutual status means that gains by one group must be balanced by losses by another. There will be no government backstop or guarantee. The paper shows that the rules required to address this risk in an auto-enrolment context will have very little impact on contributors and will allow retired members considerable flexibility in how they claim their benefits. The two rules that will probably cause the most contention are a prohibition on transfers in or out and an obligation on members to take a specified percentage of their account value in cash at retirement. Neither rule is particularly onerous. The prize for adhering to those rules is a more than 50% uplift in benefits. That is a price worth paying.
Thank you very much. What I particularly liked about this essay was the fact that it addresses this loss in value caused by the artificial boundary at retirement between pensions and insurance regulatory environments, which seems rather outdated in the world of pensions freedoms and drawdowns. However, Colm, tell me a bit more about some of the risks and challenges that you might see in practice. I was slightly concerned about asking consumers to make important decisions at age 75, and we're very much relying on the equity risk premium here, which the government might need a bit more help with some other kinds of investments, all kinds of anything, to be honest, in terms of the nation's sustainability and growth agenda. And as a With Profits Committee chair, what's wrong with profits anyway? Why is this different?
Yeah, I mean, the big advantage of this over with profits is that, first of all, there is no investment discretion. The problem with profits is that you can have a forced move from equities into bonds at just the wrong time when market values are falling, which is what you don't do. My system is saying you invest in equities all the time, so there's no question there. The second thing is that there is no element of discretion. I mean, in my days, it was the appointed actuary would make decisions on the bonus, stick his finger or her finger in the air and sort of make a decision on it. There is no discretion on this whatsoever. This paper goes into great detail on the formula for calculating the smooth return there, but it is a very formulaic approach. There is no discretion for anyone on that. So, and I suppose the other nice thing about it too is that even in a difficult environment, that you still have positive returns at the start. I don't know, Matthew, can I show maybe another slide there?
I would think so, just the one.
Okay. No, but move on from that one. I think that's a bit too complex. Yeah, this example, it shows the formula for assuming the start of the scheme on the 1st of January 2020. Okay, now as you will recall, in early 2020, as the sort of COVID took hold, people started getting panic. So you do have there a 15% drop in market values in March, and okay, it sort of recovered. But if you look though at the smooth returns, they are lovely and steady all the way, and that is applying a mechanical formula. There is no discretion whatsoever. But it means, now I do refer obliquely at times in the paper to psychological advantages of smoothing. And I think for the group of people we're talking about, the behavioural psychology is important, and in other papers, I focused on that. But just if you look at this, there's a 20% gap between the highest and lowest returns over just that 6-month period on the market values. For the smooth returns, it's only a 0.2% variation in return. And the system works, even looking at the Japanese system, what happened in Japan. Yes, it fell apart eventually. Well, it didn't fall apart if people contributed, but it would have got a problem. But it would have taken 10 years for it to get a problem. And you remember the Japanese market in 1990, the imperial palace in Tokyo was supposedly worth more than the entire state of California. And you had bank prices, share prices, were on a PE multiple of around 60. And when you think as well that the earnings that they were based on had a lot of unrealized profits. So the system actually does work. In the context of auto-enrollment, where people are paying in regularly every month, so you have the rough and the smooth balance. People, if they're paying in before or after, sometimes they win, sometimes they lose.
Thanks very much. We're going to move on to Craig now, and then to Nick. And then after we've been through all three of the commended entries, there'll be an opportunity for those of you that have got burning questions, ideally ones that join up all three of these entries, to pose those to the panel. Craig, tell us a bit more about your idea.
Thank you very much, Sally. I think before I start to say it's fantastic to be here again in a sort of real-life environment with fellow actuaries. I think unlike Matt, I think I only have good memories of this building. I think I was first year for my qualification ceremony and last year for another prize, so this is like my favourite place. So I think the first thing that strikes me when thinking about this essay actually was it was actually written some time ago now. The essay was submitted back in, I think, April or May this year, which feels like another lifetime in a way. It's been clearly a fairly tumultuous time since then. So I expect there may be some discussion later of what's happened in recent months and some thoughts about that. So I'll put that to one side just now. But I think it's interesting to note that the introductory section of my essay was pondering on the sort of profound implication, as I saw it, for pensions and savings of all form that result from the sort of extraordinary fall in long-term real interest rates in particular that have occurred really over the last 20, 25 years. And since the writing of the essay, those interest rates have come back up somewhat, but they're still materially lower than the sort of historical norms of the 80s and 90s. So I think the fundamental point there, I think, unfortunately, if you like, does still stand. We're still in a macroeconomic environment, for whatever multitude of reasons, that produces an enormous sort of headwind for long-term saving. If you like, the sort of fabled power of compound interest is essentially working in reverse when long-term real interest rates are indeed negative, rather than the 250 basis points that we once assumed was the norm. Anyway, on to the essay. So my essay, it considers both, if you like, the resolution of legacy-defined benefit pensions and the ongoing provision of DC benefits. And I suppose if there's a central theme to the essay, it's that it considers whether the risks that arise in any form of advanced funding of pensions, in particular financial market risks and longevity risks, whether these current systems of pension provision are resulting in those risks being held in the places that are most conducive to the sustainable, equitable, efficient, cost-efficient delivery of those pensions. And my analysis is really, I suppose it's effectively developed from what I would almost refer to as a sort of couple of self-evident axioms, really, that are that, firstly, insurance firms and similar institutions, they exist to pool diversifiable risk. That's what they do. And so to the extent that individuals have diversifiable risks, it's very natural that you seek to transfer them and pool them in that efficient way. But at the same time, to the extent that the individual has an appetite to bear non-diversifiable risk, it actually makes sense that they should bear it directly, because since those risks can't be diversified, there's no useful function performed by transferring them to a third-party entity. So these are sort of, as I say, what I think of as fairly basic axioms of how I think about the insurance function. But they sort of can do a lot of work, actually, when you look at the way our pension systems work, and they perhaps highlight a number of apparent, if you like, oddities or interesting features to the pension systems. So perhaps the most obvious one that I think is there is the current tendency for DC pensioners to retain virtually all of their own longevity risk. So this seems highly counterintuitive that they should seek to bear this risk that is both highly consequential in the sense that there is a real risk that the pension fund will expire, unfortunately, before they do. And it's a risk that is also largely diversifiable. Now, it's important to recognise that some element of longevity risk is certainly not diversifiable. There is some long-term uncertainty in how mortality trends will evolve over the period of 20 or 30 years. And no matter how much of mortality risk we pool, we can't diversify that away. So there is that non-diversifiable element. But at the same time, there is another element which is diversifiable, and I would argue that that element is actually much larger for the individual. So, there is some uncertainty for a 6-year-old around whether he lives 1 year or 41 years. And there is some uncertainty about the non-diversifiable piece, about whether on average a pool of 6-year-olds will live 18 years or 22 years perhaps. But the magnitude of the diversifiable risk there is much greater than the non-diversifiable piece. And for the insurer, going back to our previous comments, it's naturally the non-diversifiable element of that risk that is part of the risk that causes all the problems. That's where they have to hold capital for. That's the risk that they can't shake off, if you like, and they can't pool and diversify away. But for the individual, as I say, it's a diversifiable element that's actually a much bigger piece. So to me, that points towards longevity risk solutions where the individual would naturally retain that non-diversifiable element whilst transferring and allowing an insurer to pool the diversifiable element. That would be a much more cost-effective arrangement, if you like, of longevity risk exposure. And it's interesting that I think since the sort of end of compulsory annuitisation a number of years ago, there's perhaps been a fairly limited amount of innovation in longevity risk solutions in the UK market. But I think this is an area which is sort of ripe for evolution, and I think we do see, certainly in natural literature recently, a number of ideas along this lines being explored in terms of product designs that can sustainably do that job in a way that can work for individuals as well as for institutions. So I hope there's more there, but I think to me it's a very obvious, if you like, piece of the overall puzzle that is ripe for improvement. Perhaps less straightforwardly, and actually I think this overlaps quite a bit with some of Colm's points. I think investment risk that's borne today by DC pension members, I think we can also think about how that can be bifurcated into diversifiable and non-diversifiable components of risk. And by that I mean that there is a fairly broad academic consensus, to the extent such things exist, that when we look at the empirical behaviour of risky asset returns, they tend to exhibit more market price volatility than can be explained by sort of rational changes in the expectations for their future cash flows. And that sort of opens a door, if you like, to this idea that to the extent this sort of excess short-term market price volatility exists, then it's plausible that it could essentially be pooled over time and diversified away by some form of intergenerational risk pooling mechanism. And Paul will explain one example of that. But I think it's important to note that there are sort of conceptual and practical challenges to such mechanisms. One is that they do rely on this empirical observation of there being some sort of excess short-term vol that sort of mean reverts and diversifies away. It does rely in the future looking like the past in terms of that statistical property. And whilst there's the strong, I think, empirical evidence support that property has existed in the past, inevitably this isn't physics and we can't sort of prove, if you like, that property will be there in the future. So we have to bear that in mind when thinking about the design and the sort of potential safety valves, if you like, I think, for these systems when those types of properties indeed, if and when they do turn out to not be present in the long term. And we have to work out what long term means in that regard. And the second practical challenge is that it does require future generations to step up when earlier generations need them to. This is a type of pooling that, because it works over time, it's unusual in the sense that you have a good idea of whether or not sharing the risk is going to be in your personal self-interest or not, because you can see the past, if you like. So it requires, as I say, future generations to sort of be there to step up and take the losses, if you like, but it's not necessarily in the self-interest. And also things like auto-enrollment and compulsion as one means of addressing that. But again, it's something I think we have to recognise as a sort of limitation or a challenge in these sorts of systems. Finally, as we move on from DC, I think one of the interesting things I find, particularly when sort of comparing and contrasting DC and DB pension provision today, is that DC members tend to exhibit quite a marked investment risk appetite. So when they come to make their investment choices, they tend not to invest in a way that attempts to deliver the types of sort of fixed cash flows that would be provided by a DB pension. They tend to take far more risk than that. And given this, I think it's arguably somewhat surprising that so many DB members opt to stay in DB when it delivers a kind of benefit that appears so unenticing, if you like, to the DC population. So put it another way, if DB members or biopolicy holders were offered a unit-linked version of their annuity benefit, where they directly participated in investment returns of the underlying fund, the investment risk appetite implied by DC preferences suggests that such a choice could be of interest to many of them, and it would arguably be a lot cheaper and simpler to deliver than the long-term guaranteed cash flows of DB pensions. So, coming full circle, that type of outcome, I think, is consistent with my earlier sort of, if you like, axiomatic sort of starting points that insurers should exist to pool diversifiable risk, and to the extent non-diversifiable risk is sought by the individual, then it is most naturally borne directly by them. And with that, I'll happily pass over some any
Thanks very
questions.
much, Craig. You've actually answered a few main questions that I had, but I will come back with one little question in a minute. Certainly, what I enjoyed about the essay was a very thorough and instructive analysis of why we are where we are today, which I would commend to everybody as and when we go public. And particularly this analysis of diversifiable and non-diversifiable risks, which goes to the heart of the role of insurance and effectively cross-subsidies, which when we've had a government, I don't know what the next Prime Minister is going to say about levelling up or levelling up for all, but some of the policies around consumer duty that are hitting our world seem to imply that everybody has to have the best without anybody paying for it. And it's very important, I think, as a profession to be very considered about which risks and which costs are being borne by whom and what makes that fair and sustainable. There are several hooks in your essay about innovations in CDC, in insurance and annuities. And my little question is, which one would you most like to see developed and why?
It's a good question. I think there's opportunity for all of these areas, frankly, to evolve and be improved. But I think ultimately we're in a world now where DB is ultimately a legacy. It's a legacy problem that has to be managed as efficiently, as effectively as it can be. But it's unlikely to be the form of future provision, whether we like it or not. So we need to find a way of making DC work better. And I think there are a number of angles to that. I think as Colin pointed out, the idea of intergenerational risk pooling and, sort of, if you like, taking advantage of this inherent, if you like, market inefficiency that appears to empirically be there is a natural thing for actuaries to grasp. And indeed, as you alluded to earlier, it's what with profits was all about, really. And for hundreds of years, it worked. There's something alluring about that. We have to be disciplined about how to implement it. We have to recognise that it's not some sort of magic trick that actuaries have got some special power to sort of dispense, which was perhaps the view a generation or two ago. So we have to be clear about the sort of basis for that and why this form of cross-subsidy is indeed sort of fair and reasonable and sustainable. So I think that's key. But I think, yeah, to me that's a very, as I say, enticing opportunity. But also aligned to that, getting that to work well, also talked about equities, but there is also a role, I think, for illiquid assets in that mix. So to the extent that, I'm sure we'll talk about liquidity at a later point tonight, but to the extent that these liabilities are uniquely illiquid, and to the extent that market prices for illiquid things are cheaper, then it seems very natural we find a way of getting some of these funds invested in illiquid things to take advantage of that. Now, I don't think DC has managed to do that very well to date. And so it seems a very natural area of sort of further improvement in the DC landscape to facilitate better solutions in that regard.
Thanks very much. Nick, I think you're beginning to see why it was so difficult judging these entries, and Nick's not going to make it any easier for us. Could you tell us a bit more about your essay?
Okay, I'll try. Can you all hear me? Well, first of all, I'd like to say how nice it is to be coming to sort of a home from home. Matt's pointed out that we haven't been back here for at least 3 or 4 years, and I used to come here all the time when I was on council. It's a lovely place. And then I'm also home because I'm amongst a lot of old friends, which is really nice to see you all. And I hope Sir John Kay is one of my intellectual gurus, and Sweeche, well, thank you so much for organising this prize, and you've also been a great kind of influence on me. Also, just a bit about my career. I started my career with Punter Southall, which is amazing, and I'm really touched that I'm now here receiving a prize. And I have great fond memories of my first job at Punter Southall, and Stuart Southall was one of my first bosses, and he was almost the last person crazy enough to employ me. And since then, I've been realised that I'm unemployable, and I have to, if I want gainful employment, I have to create my own entities. Another person who is crazy enough to employ me, the only other person really, is David Callans, and my consultancy firm, Callan Consulting. It's quite unusual. We go around the world advising governments on their pensions and social security systems, and we were known for doing the Chilean reforms in the late 70s. David did that. And the Chilean reforms, if you don't know, were where you took a kind of failing pay-as-you-go system and changed it into a personal account system, not so dissimilar to a current auto-enrollment we've got in the UK. And we did this all around the world, first in South America and then in Eastern Europe. Because the pay-as-you-go systems were failing, they're basically Ponzi schemes where governments promise people big pensions, didn't put enough money in, right? And but it's over the years and recently it's come to our thinking that these don't work either. So the Chilean system is in the process of failing, and if you look in the UK, we don't actually. You can't put in money into a pension and then get a big enough pension to live off. Slightly controversial statement. And to my great skepticism, someone's invented a system which is a government system which I would be totally prejudiced against, but it seems to work. And these are the Swedes. Well, they kind of would, didn't they? So they had this system called partially funded, notionally defined contribution system. I go into it in a bit of detail in my paper, but it's actually better than whatever DC personal account system for a number of reasons. One, it actually pays a pension to people, which you can put in money and you get a pension out, which you can afford. And secondly, kind of the main selling point for me, actually there's a third selling point, but that's a bit too controversial, but the second selling point is the friction costs are much less, because if you think about our system, we put money into pension and then you have a whole ecosystem of intermediaries who take out some of your pension, right, and in the name of efficiency. Whereas in the Swedish system, I can't pronounce the name of what it's called, you just have a few not very well paid civil servants, calculating evaluation, and they're kind of admin staff. So the friction costs, the cost running a fraction of what a private sector funded scheme is. So kind of the basis of my entry was this introducing a Swedish-style notional defined contribution partially funded scheme, which I can go into more details if you like. And that's, if anyone read this is what they would focus on because we're all actuaries, right? But actually, the more important thing in my paper, and by the way, I just want to kind of fess up to a total failure of risk management. A few days ago, I reread my paper, which, as you said, I did in May, and I go, oh my God, there's no way I can summarize this in 3 minutes, so I'm going to just assume that I'm not going to win. So, I'll do it. So the important bit is what does sustainability mean? So in my role in Calland, we look at social security system, we do valuations over 75 years, right, to see if the system is going to be fundable over that stage. Now, if you think back 75 years, that's 1945, 1947, just after the Second World War, quite a lot has changed since then. In 1947, you couldn't have predicted most of those changes. So what I can predict, though, is in the next 75 years, there will be quite a lot of other changes, which I can't predict, as in work of John Kay there, Sir John would refess. So if we think about sustainability, I kind of given it 3 spheres. The first one is you need to provide a pension that people want and or need, and they might be slightly different to each other. You need to have a system which is flexible enough over the next indefinite period, say 75 to 100 years, can cope with the massive significant changes that are going to happen, which we can't predict. And the third thing, which is if you've read, the 2 people who've read my book will know my views on this, that the current, we as actuaries concentrate on the liability side, right? But the asset side make a big difference. They are society's capital, and how those assets are invested makes a big difference to the future well-being of the economy. By the way, and if we think 75 years, that equates to about 400 prime ministers, and we think about, well, what has the current turmoil got to do with how we invest the money? And it's kind of based on a mistake, which comes to an economic principle called Arrow-Debreu, which is that the wise market will allocate capital to most efficient users. And if you look at actually what happens, that just doesn't happen. So we've got to be cognizant of there are assets in the pension system is the keeper of the assets, and where it allocates the assets is important. And we've got some very pressing social needs like the climate change and levelling up and name your choice. And the current system actually doesn't contribute to the sustainability of its society through its investment. So the introduction of the Swedish-style pension system, which the most important element is not the NDC, but it's the governance structure, where you have an independent agency tasked with ensuring the sustainability of the fund, and sustainability being, you can calculate that enough money is going in to pay for, and most of your assets are actually future contributions, right? That's quite an easy calculation to do, and also, the sustainability of the scheme just depends on long-term population projections, which actually change fairly slowly. But the kind of how we're getting from the sustainability element to coming up with a system is, first of all, to redefine what a pension means. So I've redefined a pension system as an institution which supports people's financial security as they get older, and say, well, what's different about that to current? Well, it's taking a holistic view. So part of financial security is paid employment. Maybe when people get older, they can cut down on their work, but people are often happier and healthier if they remain in employment. And how do we achieve that? Well, it's no rocket science. We know how people, keep happier and healthier as they get older. They live a healthier lifestyle as they're younger. They do lots of exercise. They eat a healthy diet, and also careers change faster and faster. So people will need to retrain throughout their life, and they need help with that. So that's the kind of first aspect of a kind of more holistic definition of sustainability. The second aspect is that the pension system needs to keep aligned with the needs of people and its own purpose. And these are going to change with time as society and the economy change. And so you need some intelligence, if you like, to evaluate the long-term trends and how the system needs to be adjusted. So I feel the weakness of my proposal is introducing not one, but two new institutions. And whenever the institutions are introduced, particularly by the government, they generally go wrong. They generally don't do what you want them to do. But on the other hand, I don't see any choice. So first of all, there's this pensions platform, which is based on the Swedish model. We know the Swedish model works, so you can introduce it. The second is a much more higher level committee I call the Pensions Committee, which is sort of modelled on the Climate Change Committee, and its mandate is to look at pensions in a holistic way and to look at what future trends are needed. Right? One kind of product, if you like, which is currently needed is long-term critical health insurance, which, you know, to think about how we deal with the social care crisis, and that could easily be fitted in with the platform. So that's kind of two, how we deal with one, you know, setting up a system where people's pension, you know, people can have a cheap pension which they can live on, and secondly, this provides a platform that you can add and take away new products in the very long term when they're needed, and also this pensions committee which looks at more holistic picture and interacts with long-term government policy. And the third part of how we invest our money in the interests of society, well, the Swedish-style system has buffer funds, so it's not entirely unfunded. Part of the contributions go to pay pensioners, and part go into these buffer funds, right? But the buffer funds, their purpose is not to maximise risk return, like to pay a liability, like a standard UK pension fund is. It is to provide a buffer and to also contribute to the overall well-being and growth of the sustainable growth of the economy. And so you can give these funds an authentic dual mandate. So we're in a process in the world where ESG has become a kind of dominant philosophy, but it's still, you have a typical pension fund needs to maximize its risk return, and ESG is always going to be an extra. So these funds turn that on its head. So they need to be invested in things like infrastructure, impact investment funds, which demonstrate they give a positive benefit to society within the kind of discipline of a risk return framework, which will attempt to overcome the UK's terrible, appalling in low investment in a country which has a massively high amount of capital. And then within my proposal, which is kind of much longer and I can't really summarise it very well, I do also have a couple of controversial bits which I feel are essential for the good of the country and society, but are not necessarily essential for my overall design, which one would be to buy up fossil fuel company assets and wind them down over a long time. And the other is, this will be very controversial in this room, is to transfer DB assets schemes into this new system. But we can deal with those in the question. So, sorry, my proposal was kind of, I found it to capture all the things it needs to do. It had to be fairly complicated and complex. And it's very, very hard to do it in justice in 3 to 5 minutes. And I hope that you got something out of that, and I can happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Nick. Yes, there were some huge ideas in Nick's essay, and I particularly like the way that you covered ideas around the changing shape of work, the role of technology and AI in delivering pensions, sustainability not only in the environmental sense, but also in terms of long-term care, and subject close to my heart, which is the legacy DB schemes, where there is a boundary problem there. We have got the suboptimal treatment of a huge pool of assets. It doesn't necessarily need to be managed in that way. In view of time, I'm not going to ask you a specific question, but I'm just going to turn to the audience to see if we've got a burning question that somebody has. Oh, we've got two. And please make this a question rather than a party political broadcast. Thank you, Mr. Spencer.
Yeah, no, I'll just be brief, and actually it's to a certain extent amplify Nick's point about sustainability. I mean, Colm, if I can ask, I assume you talked about equities, but it could be actually adjusted into any sort of growth and socially useful assets. Interesting, Craig, on your sort of point of view from philosophical. You talked about undiversifiable risk. Actually, what I'd like to introduce the idea is agency. There are some risks that actually over the long run we can potentially think about managing, and is that a purpose? And then maybe coming across three of you that, should we be thinking about the purpose of these pension assets, if you like, an alternative green investment sort of development bank type status for these assets that's creating the good for the country?
Thank you. And there is this joke about actuaries. You ask an actuary the time and they tell you how to build a watch. Please tell me the time answer to those questions.
Okay. Just on the equities point, I used the word equities, and I did say in a footnote that I used it as a shorthand for assets that have real assets that have equity-like returns in the long term and equity-like volatility. And I would completely agree, and Nick would have the same point, on illiquid assets. The problem with illiquid assets in DC funds is this whole mania that there is, that we have to measure and measure values nearly every bloody day, which is crazy for something. I'm saying, look, you're only going to give a 1% weighting in this calculation to current market value. So therefore, if you're a bit out on the market value, it doesn't matter. So it means that there is complete freedom to put money into things like infrastructure, but also the fact that you don't have no transfers, you don't have this risk that the money will disappear in the market. So it really is long term. And as I said, because of the whole thing that assets are transferred between members at the smooth price, the trustees can genuinely take a 50-year investment horizon all the time from this. And that just changes completely the way you look at things.
Great. Comments from...
well, yes, I agree. But that's why I think that, we've been talking about how you value that, and there's this liquidity problem, and whether you use market value. And actually, I don't think you can square the circle, and that's why I've kind of come up with a kind of radically different solution so even within my what do I call them, buffer funds, even then there is a problem of how the buffer funds measure their returns, and because they're a kind of national scheme, they'll be under a massive amount of scrutiny. And in Sweden, the ATP funds have developed tools with time. So my hope was you won't get it right first, but you will over the years develop better metrics for where you're not constrained by giving day-by-day or annual valuations, but how you measure performance without doing that.
Anything you want to add, Craig?
I think just very briefly on illiquid assets, I mean, they have challenges, but someone has to own these things. And who better than the balance sheets with illiquid liabilities? So there must be a solution there.
Great. Bren.
By your injunction not to make it a part of the broadcast. I have got a genuine question, which is, because we haven't read the papers, we obviously don't know what's in them, but none of you mentioned what the state scheme is providing. So either explicitly or implicitly, you've said something about the state pension. It's the previous question, that you cannot say what the private sector should be doing unless you're clear about what the state sector is doing.
Great. So what assumptions have you made about what the state's doing here?
Oh, I have to say that I made no assumptions. I took a very narrow brief, and for a very particular reason, because Ireland is bringing in auto-enrolment, and I wanted to shape the debate of what auto-enrolment would be in Ireland. So it is very simple. It is auto-enrolment and nothing more than that.
Great.
Yeah, somewhat similar. I think I try to steer away from the topic of the state pension, because I think ultimately it's a topic for politicians and political preferences. And I think we should be very careful as actuaries that we don't express political views as professional advice. And so I sort of try to X out as much as possible the state system. And I take your point that obviously it does matter for what we expect the private sector to do, but I did try to focus more on, given we have a private sector, how do we efficiently design it, if you like, to deliver outcomes in a sustainable, equitable, cost-effective way.
Okay, well, I mean, I'm starting this, Britain doesn't have a Pillar 1 system, so I'm introducing a Pillar 1 system. Yeah, what's a Pillar 1 system, right? Which is the thing I've described. We do have a Pillar 0, our basic state pension, and I feel, which people are very attached to. Right? It's an institution, you can't like get rid of it or anything. So my idea is when people, if my proposed system would ever get adopted and introduced, you'll get more and more popular buy-in, and then you'll gradually roll the basic state pension into it as a minimum. So people at the moment pay national insurance contributions, so effectively they'll pay this into the new system, and it should give a bigger pension than the basic state pension. If it doesn't, you will have the current system as a minimum, but I don't want to make any judgments on what the retirement age should be or on whether you should have the triple lock, because I felt that, and I haven't done any of the modelling on it either, so this was a higher level design rather than a specific thing that politicians talk about at the moment.
Now, I think I saw another hand over here. That's the last question we've got time for.
Hi, thank you. So my question's maybe a little bit related, and it's based on a book I'm currently reading called Invisible Woman. And in that book, they highlight almost the gender pension gap that exists because of the disproportionate amount of unpaid care work that women currently undertake. So yeah, I'm just kind of thinking, how do you, who is the people, and how do we consider that group of the population who's doing valuable work, but value doesn't necessarily equal an income in the traditional sense?
I mean, I know exactly the point that you're making. It doesn't come directly into mind because, as I say, mine is just so simple that you put money in, you get a return on it, and you take the money out then. Now, so I think the question then comes down to it's essentially a political one. Do you give credit contributions to, say, a woman working in the home? You know, that's, sorry, my answer to it. And to be honest, you know, it is beyond the scope of what I was looking at. But you know, I think it would be a definite issue in auto-enrollment as to whether you would have implied contributions for women, say, working from the home.
Great.
Yeah, I'm afraid sort of likewise, really. I mean, I think it's not a problem that will go away without political action, I'm sure, because, you know, even though under various metrics, I'm sure there's been some progress in gender inequality. I suspect the increasing sort of burden of sort of care for sort of, you know, older people that's only going to increase, I think, in coming years. I think will create new challenges there. But like Colm, I'm afraid it's not something I really try to address in actuarial analysis. I think it is ultimately only a problem that can be solved by political means rather than the actuarial ones, although I do hope that we can play a useful role in facilitating that.
Yeah, I'm going to disagree with you two and try and answer that, but in a kind of a bleak way. So basically, what we do is we save money, we have banks, which you kind of invest in, they try and increase the wealth of the country, right? But wealth is defined as stuff which you can, financial stuff, right? But wealth, if you think of wealth in a wider context, like I've tried to think of wealth in the page, well, the wealth of the country is its institutions, its court systems, the royal family, its beautiful countryside, its social capital, the people, right? And when we've got these trillions in our wealth, our pension saving, but it's in financial wealth, right? And so we need to move to think about how do we actually invest in wealth, like women giving labour for their children. I don't even like to put it in those terms because it makes it the wrong way. And because we're more and more prejudiced to this financial idea of wealth, that this is vital for the wealth of the country. Right? And so I'm going towards a system where actually all our assets are transferred into this, which actually puts other things, I call them impact investment funds or investing in social infrastructure. But of how we actually, divert investment into this kind of real idea of wealth, which is, the if you like, the challenge of the kind of ESG, or how do we invest in nature and society. Right? So I feel that on a high level, that's the ultimate aim, right, of what I'm trying to do. Right? But it's not so easy to do that. But there's also another technical on the fact that you've got people who've got irregular labour or income, how they contribute, and it tends to be. So a lot of my experience in developing countries like African countries, you've got informal workers, and those social security systems have developed kind of cool ways that you can get informal workers to join and contribute regularly, and that might be more appropriate a start for people who do informal labour or at home to contribute. So.
I think that's a good example of why actually none of the essays really developed the gender pensions gap, and there are still some challenges that have to be addressed across the system where, again, this is the end of the beginning rather than actually the full solution. And as Nick's alluded to, until we really value financially what we value as a society and economy, there's going to be a bit of a gap there. Right, it's time to hand out certificates and take photos and clap your hands off in the way that we do in this hall. I used to be honorary secretary, which involved handing the certificates on qualification day to all the fellows, so I've got some form on this. But I'd like to call forward Stuart Southall, who's going to present the prizes on behalf of Dr. Southall, and Matt, who I think is also going to feature in the photos. So if we have, whose certificate do we have first? We've got Craig Turnbull first. We're going to do the photos over here. So, Stuart, if you could take that, and if Craig could go, just the luck of the draw, Craig, it's alphabetical. Well done, Craig. The way on fellowship days that you asked all the parents and avid supporters to wait till the end so that their hands wouldn't fall off. Right, Nick Silver. Congratulations, Nick. And finally, Colin Fagan. Right, and unless you want to be quizzed on somebody else's paper, I invite you to take your seats. Thank you. You're on now, yeah?
Thank you, Sally, and let me add my congratulations to the three winners of that section. We now turn our attention to the second set of awards, which were for answers to the question, what would be a sustainable economic and finance system for the public interest, sponsored by Milliman. In this question, we were asking participants to produce a paper on a rather wide canvas. What has gone wrong in the context of the British and indeed Western financial services system, and what can be done to improve things and make it better serve the public? We called on entrants to assess a quite variety of factors, the increasing transfer of risk from the corporate sector to individuals, and I should refer you to the IFOA report on the great risk transfer, and to raise questions about what is involved in digitisation and digital revolution. We had quite a lot of discussion as to who should actually get prizes in this particular session. So I'm pleased to say that what we decided was that we would commend 2 entrants as well as picking our second and finally our first prize winner. So let me announce the winners for this question and invite our first placed entrants to join me. So the 2 commended entrants are Sandy Trust, who I believe is to appear virtually. Is he appearing? Apparently not. I think you're on mute and turn on your video. A phrases we all got used to over the last year. Oh. Thank you for joining us, Sandy. We were despairing, I'm afraid. But you're very welcome, and I'm only sorry you can't be with us here in Staple Inn. And our second commended entrant is Professor Allard Jones. Would you like to stand up? Now the second placed winner, second placed entrant rather, is Chris Sutton. Chris. Is he here? Ah. Well done, Chris. And finally, the moment you've all been waiting for, which is who is the winner of the first place in this competition? And the answer is Martin White. Martin. And Martin, perhaps you'd now join me on the stage and you can explain what it was that impressed the judges sufficiently to invite you to address us tonight. Martin.
Thank you.
Please.
Well, good evening, everybody. I think I want to adjust what I'm going to say a little bit based on the discussion we've just had. So I'm going to add a little bit to what I would have said, my prepared thoughts. First of all, I'd like to thank the Institute and faculty for the initiative to hold this competition. And I'd like to thank the sponsors and all those, including the judges, who have been involved in running it. And I'm extremely pleased and honoured that the judges liked my essay enough to select it today. We know that there are many aspects of life in which actuaries could contribute to the public interest outside the mainstream activities of our paid employment. I think the term the big society, which was used by a British Prime Minister, David Cameron, not so many years ago, still has relevance. Perhaps I wrote this before the news came. Perhaps its relevance is even greater today. Indeed, so many of the things that make our society run depend on volunteers to lead them. Local government is a case in point. We have people standing for councils, we have parish councils, we have school governing bodies, and the Citizens Advice Organisation, which provides vital services to many people in difficulty, is reliant on volunteers. I know a bit about that, as my wife Caroline, who is with me here today, works for Citizens Advice. But when you think more about it, so many things just wouldn't exist without volunteers. You may want to attend a church, join a choir, a cricket club, a sailing club. You may want to take your children to football practice on Saturday mornings. Behind all these, there is a mass of committed people putting in spare time, all reliant on each other, and in the process, getting a sense of purpose, achievement, and one hopes, harmony and fun. I know of a number of actuaries who serve on bodies like those I've just described, essentially contributing a bit of specialised financial nous to the team. Now, the subject matter of my paper is extremely simple. As it happens, in asking John Kay to chair the judges, the Institute selected one of the very best-known writers on the subject. I wasn't courting favour when referencing a number of his works in the paper. It would have been a serious omission not to mention them. Put simply, the financial sector exploits the public to a degree that I think is completely unacceptable, and something needs to be done about it. However, I conclude, and I explain why in the paper, that to really make a difference, something radically different has to happen. In the paper, the longest section has this mouthful of a title: Information Asymmetry and the Problem of Who to Trust, Decades of Regulatory Reluctance. In this section, I talk about a succession of events to improve things, one of which was the Kay Review, and another the Sandler Review. But the one outcome which, whatever reviews might recommend, seems stubbornly not to happen, is material reform that actually puts the interests of the consumers of financial services, in other words, the public at large, above those of the financial sector. What people need to know is where to go for unbiased and knowledgeable information and advice. And my contention is that hardly any of the players in the system are genuinely unbiased. The financial sector still has a culture of sales, where people think they have a right to take an annual percentage of people's wealth. However, if you only know how, you can avoid this, but no one's going to tell you. So my proposal involves individuals who have this knowledge and who are not conflicted from speaking out, telling the public the essential financial truths that the financial sector is never going to tell them. I did once have a hope that the Financial Conduct Authority would have a policy of encouraging this. I even wrote in a submission to the about-to-form Financial Conduct Authority making suggestions about culture. However, this is partly where my section titled Decades of Regulatory Reluctance comes from. That hope was disappointed. And I know a number of people who have been on the consumers panel of the Financial Services Authority, and their thoughts don't disagree with me. So what do I want? Unlike the other suggestions out here, which is ideas for somebody to do something, I want to actually do something. What I want is publicity for the idea, so that just a few people come forward to help. I'm not relying on anybody else at all. Doesn't require politics, doesn't require anything else. There is a lovely precedent here I'd like to mention. In 1992, I was one of a group of people who set up a voluntary, not-for-profit organisation called the UK Shareholders Association. For me, it was a way in which I could use my actuarial knowledge in the public interest. There are a number of objectives, but one of them was to try and represent the interests of savers and investors. After a while, I discovered that we had a retired actuary leading the policy team, Roy Colburn. Roy was instrumental in supporting the commission ban that came out of the Retail Distribution Review. And another lovely thing to mention is that both Roy and Colin know each other going back many years, which is just so nice. The UK Shareholders Association is still around today. Over the years, the idea of approaching people for financial support for the organisation has been raised, but we are resolutely independent of the financial sector. Paul Miners, who sadly died recently, was a good friend to us, came to speak to us a number of times. And he very strongly advised us that without complete independence, we just wouldn't have the credibility we needed. The core campaigning title I like to use today is Savers Take Control, which you could Google and find. The idea is not to give the impression that this is about rich people enriching themselves further. Some of our members are worried that the title shareholders itself has a sort of feel that puts people off. Instead, it's about providing useful and truthful information to the public in the face of a financial sector who would rather this did not happen. But I'm also thinking about the equally catchy term, who to trust. I'm just hoping that with publicity, I might just find a few retired actuaries sharing my concerns that help at the idea of helping, that jump at the idea of helping. Now that's the amount of items I had prepared to say, but just a couple more thoughts that cropped up as we go through. What I see happening in my ideal world is the financial sector takes a much smaller amount of people's wealth. And over a whole lifetime, you can easily lose half your wealth, the financial sector. On the other hand, I don't think that business today is necessarily operating in a way society needs. I think there's a bit of a national consensus about that. I would like to see business operating more patiently, less greedily, and a number of the things that I'm proposing would lead towards that. If we have a financial approach to life and somehow people get a well done for pushing up the share price, we know all the nasty cascading things that happen as a result of that. So some of the things I'm talking about are reforms to pay, but with this kind of change, it doesn't happen without political pressure, and by there being a body that people can really trust about finance, that's actually listened and respected above anybody in politics, I would hope that we could educate the public about the need to be more long-term, less greedy, and more to consider about the good that companies do, rather than just the profits that are made for the executives. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Martin. You're reminding me of, two events. One was when, I don't know whether it was you or someone else, invited me to a meeting of the UK Shareholders Association.
It was me, and it was in Southampton or thereabouts, or Bournemouth.
Exactly. And I had two invitations for that particular day, one of which was from you in the Shareholders Association, and the other was from Financial Advisors, which was held at Monte Carlo. And I think that contrast tells us quite a lot. The other thing I remember is doing a sum that asked the question if Warren Buffett had paid himself 2 and 20 on his over his investment career, how much of the funds of Berkshire Hathaway would have belonged to Warren Buffett and how much to Berkshire Hathaway. And the stunning answer was Buffett 90%, Berkshire Hathaway 10%. And I remember this number was so unbelievable that having passed it over for publication, I actually, while on a walk in France, panicked and called up my assistant, my personal assistant, and told her exactly what keys to press on the calculator in order to verify that this was indeed the correct answer. But it is the correct answer, and there's a lot we can learn from that. So really, Martin, the essence of your proposal is what you call shareholders take back control.
Yes.
And the central problem which that faces, as you acknowledge, is how do shareholders acquire the capacity to take back control in a world in which financial education is very limited, and in which regulation, which might, as one thought, be designed to help consumers, actually tends to operate in the opposite direction.
You put the challenge exactly. And the proposal I have is that there are knowledgeable volunteers who do this simply because they want to do something worthwhile. Quite a lot of people who have enough knowledge to share with people, typically work in the financial sector itself. Whilst working, they have got no ability to speak up. I mean, I'm lucky, I work in the financial sector, but I work for a company where I'm very confident that the person in charge of that company would probably be more happy than the other way at what I'm doing here now. But
he's not on 2 and 20.
He's not on 2 and 20. He's on about 100k a year, as it happens. But only by establishing a body that will tell the truth and to have there a little bit of a buzz about the fact that such a body exists, can you make this change? Now, the question is, how do you get to the point where such a body is known? If you talk to a particular journalist, there's an awful lot of people there upset by covering you. And it's an event such as this that I'm hopeful might get this idea publicised. So what we're talking about is really publicly saying the very essential and frankly blindingly obvious truths. Don't let anyone take an annual percentage of your wealth. Item number 1, for example. Item number 2, understand the nature of stock market risk. The fact that it's much better if you forget about it and go away. There are a whole host of things like that. There are, as John has indicated, some ways in which the regulatory framework actually operates against you. When I hear a discussion, let's say it's on the FT online or FT blog or something, about something or other, the journalist always ends up with, if in doubt, consult a financial advisor. Now, that is a sort of protective term. Now, John, in your book, the long and the short of it, effectively you said, if you can, go anywhere near a financial advisor. And if Roger Bolton, Roger Bootle were here, he would say exactly the same. I refer to a book of his in the paper, and he has a whole page about what's bad about financial advisors, and ends up with the fact that there are 1 or 2 that are worth their weight in gold, but there are only 1 or 2.
Right, so what do we do about this? You talked about getting publicity. Is recruiting journalists to your cause as well as what you call the guerrilla group of actuaries and people who have retired from the system?
If there were some journalists who were prepared to cover the topic and perhaps to develop themselves as an outlier amongst the journalistic community that doesn't count out the financial sector, then I think those journalists could get themselves a reputation and we can make a difference. But publicity is the issue, and what I really want is to get enough publicity within the actuarial profession, because I believe a massive resource is retired actuaries who want to give something back to society and would absolutely love the opportunity.
You also mentioned in the paper, Martin, that the city is one place where a lot of people at the point of retirement don't feel very proud of what they've done during their lifetime. It's always seemed to be extraordinary that if you look among highly paid professions, most doctors, lawyers and so on love what they've done and don't want to retire before they have to. You don't get that sense often talking to people in the city.
Certainly not what you might call the casino banks.
Yes. So how do we deal with that?
I think once again, it is a matter of publicity. I think there's very little else that one can do. I want people to come and join me. That's the end of it.
But you're being very negative about journalists. It seems to me you need on your side.
Oh, I completely do. Let's say, just like a financial advisor, a good journalist might be worth his weight in gold, or her weight in gold. The media is incredibly important. You do need to get to the people, but you need journalists who are happy to cover this, and who don't feel, oh, there's that whole group of people there we don't want to upset because they won't advertise in the paper. Big challenge. I think some of the media are much more possibly helpful than others. It's interesting. The Financial Times it seems to be a little bit mixed up. In a way, if you listen to the journalistic angle, they're relatively left-wing. But then you look at their commercial interests, they don't want to upset the financial sector too much. So they have a financial education charity. But what they don't want to do is help anyone other than the really poor and the disadvantaged. They don't want to do anything that really upsets the big money.
We've talked about a particular aspect of your essay, Martin, which is the bypassing of the existing coterie of financial advisors and providers of financial advice. Can we look at the essay topic more broadly, as you did, and talk about what we want the financial sector in broad terms to do, and the ways in which at the moment we think it fails to do that?
One of the things which I've discovered relatively recently is a concept of financial advice called financial coaches. There's a lady called Simone Gnessen who seems to be one of the leaders in this, and I believe she was an actuarial student and then moved across to a financial advisor, and then decided she wasn't able to give her clients what she really needed, and she went and did some training, some psychological training as well, and developed into a financial coach. And financial coaches, it's very close to being a life coach. So what a financial coach will do for a time spent only, a proper professional fee, is sit down with you and your family or partner and talk about the kinds of financial challenges you might have ahead, facing up to problems, and developing a sort of plan for dealing with it. And what I understand from that is that people have a wonderful feel of relief. They've got an element of their life sorted. Now, what financial coaches are not allowed to do, because they're not regulated, is to give specific advice. That's somewhere where I think a relatively small regulatory change could do the trick. If I refer to this in the paper, the Financial Conduct Authority quite recently, within the last couple of years, did a consultation on consumer investments. And the foreword of that consumer investments, written by somebody who was the acting person in charge, made a point of saying that what people needed was simple products that were cheap and already there. But people didn't seem to get them. There's obviously some obvious so whats to that. That person left, but the foreword still stayed. The document itself had no suggestions for how to tackle it. Now, the obvious thing, a long time ago, there was the idea of a project which was cat-marked, cost, access and terms. I see nothing wrong with publicising the fact that there are self-select ISAs and SIPs out there that charge a fixed annual charge, modest annual charge, take no percentage. You don't have to choose individual shares. You can bung an ETF into it and forget about it. In other words, it's a simple solution which is dead cheap and makes sense in the long term. That sort of thing, I would like to see financial coaches able to recommend with a full, if you like, legal regulatory cover.
Let me open it up for questions. And Sally has said, please, no party political broadcast. Even more, please, no bids for the Conservative Party leadership.
They might say yes.
I feel so, yes. Back there.
You are the gold dust financial advisors that you describe, as opposed to, say, the gold diggers who want to continue the gravy train for their former colleagues.
Could I ask you to start again, because we missed your voice for the first few words, sorry, until they turned the sound up.
At the beginning, I think I said thank you, Martin. So basically, how will you ensure that the right people join your organisation, and that the ones that aren't the right people, let's say, are given the boot?
I'm afraid it's a very simple answer. If you're in any way conflicted, I don't want you in the room.
Second row here.
Thank you, Martin. It's a great idea. Do you see any role in all this? Obviously, your idea is about improving information, but also is there something about encouraging financial institutions that don't have the profit motive? I'm thinking obviously of mutuals, small mutuals here, and here's the party political broadcast that I'm not allowed to do, small mutuals with a definite social aim. But is there room, do you think, for trying to encourage the growth of different types of financial institutions?
I think that for many financial functions, the natural mechanism is a mutual. And if you think about businesses that don't actually need much capital, fund managers are up there, really. We have a history, of course, of mutuals becoming non-mutuals because it suited advisors, executives, etc., to do so. So mutuals are a superb idea, but I think they need to be constituted in such a way that if somebody tries to get at the goodies disappear. I have come across a few institutions where that sort of thing has happened.
And nationwide, some other building societies that remain have now structured themselves to do that.
Lovely.
But do they in fact behave very differently from profit-making companies?
Not having the detailed knowledge, but I would wonder whether or not they have a profit stream which involves selling on commission.
I think I know the answer to that. I'm sure I know the answer to that, and I suspect a great many people in this audience.
I mean, the place to start really is, imagine you had a load of people in a room like this here, and we were to say, how are we going to collectively organise our finances? We set up a mutual on the spot, and what we're doing is looking at the needs of the individuals first and building the institution around that, rather than the other way around. Now, something that's incredibly important, I make some reference in the paper, but not too much. And during the thought leadership processes and lectures that we've had, these points have come up. You need your businesses to contribute to society. You need your businesses not just to create financial wealth. I think you need them to create what you might call psychological wealth to people working there. So my personal experience of working in a company where the people at the top...
You might explain to the audience, Martin, who you do work.
Okay. Okay, I normally don't do this because I might be talking in a sort of shareholder context, and it would be entirely inappropriate for me to try and associate the two with the other. I work for Berkshire Hathaway. And having said that, I probably ought to give a little bit of a background. Having worked in life insurance and pensions, I then, in '88, became the first actuary to work for Lloyd's of London, which was a wonderful opportunity. And they took on an actuary because they wanted somebody to help the syndicates in their arguments with the revenue about the tax treatment. So I was used to help syndicates who were in dispute to argue that they needed the reserves they needed. Now, in practice, they always needed the reserves. Their gut feel was completely right. They just weren't able to explain how. But at the same time as that, I helped on the solvency side. And I found myself telling regulators things they didn't want to face up to. At which point, my view, as a regulator, the way I describe it is I moved to the right of Genghis Khan. I would say the purpose of these institutions is to put the policyholder first, hang everything else. In practice, they were trying to duck and dive. So I had an influence. I noticed that people were buying a kind of reinsurance policy, the purpose of which was to make the figures look better. And it was to do with the fact that they weren't allowed to explicitly discount, but they could sort of implicitly discount. So you paid a £10 premium, and it said you'll get £20 back a few years later. You take £10 straight away, jolly good, profit a bit less. So I began to have an influence on how the solvency rules were drawn up, and to try and improve the integrity of that. And the broking community got to know me as somebody who had a little bit of influence in what policies were okay. And people would come along and say, well, what if we sold that policy? And I'd say, but how would you account for it? Like this. No, it's not on. The honest way to account for it is like that. Response from the broker, there's no point selling it if we can't do that. And one day, a broker brought along a chap called Tom Bolt, saying, we've got this particular policy, what do you think about it? I said, no way, people buy that for the wrong reason. Tell me about your company. It was Berkshire Hathaway. And what they did was, I said, well, tell me about it. And I got them to send me the annual report. And that is one of the days I can remember most significant in my life. I looked at the first page of Warren Buffett's letter to shareholders, and I thought to myself, this is how an actuary should think when running a business. This is fantastic. Obviously, since then, my finances have not been bad because I identified that and went into it. Perhaps more, I could have done more, but nevertheless, it's been a good thing. But the important thing is reading Warren Buffett's letters to shareholders. Now, the impact of that, I felt at the time, was more commercial value than my entire actuarial education. Now, had I not had an actuarial education, I wouldn't have been able to appreciate it as much, clearly. But this was an example of how a business should be run. It was run by somebody who clearly knew what they were doing, who admitted mistakes, who loved teaching, and was able to communicate complicated things incredibly clearly. And the result of all that is that people who work in that organization, it's a pure fluke they came along and took Lloyd's old liabilities, and I found myself working for my favorite company. That was amazing. But the result for people like me is that if I think something's wrong, I can say so. I won't get the sack. In fact, if something is wrong and I don't say so, I will get the sack. The people at the top have enough humility to admit they don't know things. But of course, to have that humility, what they really need is very deep confidence. So you're looking at a business that's got incredibly high caliber people at the top who don't leave, who stay there forever. And it's, what I've learned from that has obviously totally influenced my life ever since.
Martin, you've raised what is probably the most important question of the evening, which is actually the relationship between actuarial science, finance of business, and the performance of business. And that's probably a good moment in which to end this discussion. Congratulate you on your success and thank you for what you've done. So the certificates will now be presented for the Finance and Economy Prize. So let me move over and locate these certificates. Please welcome to the stage one of our commended entrants, Mr. Alan Jones. And he will be presented with the award by David Heath. So, David. Now, moving on to our other commended entrant, please give a big hand to Chris Sutton, who will also receive his award from David Heath. Oh, Sandy Trust. Right, I've got it. So, do we have Sandy Trust? He's online. Well, let's all congratulate Sandy Trust again. And David, you can at least display the certificate. Right, now we go on to Our second place, the runner-up to Martin, who is Chris Sutton. Chris, so apologies for that. And finally, let's show our appreciation to the first place winner, Martin White. And let me call forward Adel Drew from Milliman, who will hand over the certificate to Martin. So that concludes the awards ceremony. My thanks again to all of our entrants, to everyone who has taken part in this evening, to my fellow judges, David, Sally, and Torsten Bell, who was not able to be with us tonight. Thank you all of you for being here today. Thank you to everyone who has taken part in this excellent event. And may I invite you all to join us for some drinks and canapes.